Hi, John. We are ready to begin now.
Thank you, Maria. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webcast, WannaCry Ransomware. Were you really protected or just lucky? Presented by Michael Bryce, Paul Cayazzo, and myself. A little housekeeping before we get started. Everyone joining the conference is automatically placed on mute. If you have any questions during the webinar, please feel free to write them into the GoToMeeting webinar module on your screen, and we will get to those at the end of the session. My name is John Lucan. I'm a managing director with SEC Compliance Consultants, and I'll introduce Michael and Paul in a moment. A month ago, our webcast was also on ransomware. However, given the tremendous outreach by many of our clients since the unprecedented WannaCry ransomware attack 11 days ago, we thought it's important to do another focused on ransomware and highlighting the WannaCry attack. In our last webcast, we discussed the insidious nature of ransomware and warned about future attacks. We also stated that we will hear much more from the regulators on ransomware. And in fact, the SEC issued a risk alert on May 17th concerning the WannaCry ransomware attack. Although it was short and it directed everyone to the alert published by Homeland Security, the SEC's alert advised all registrants to perform an adequate risk assessment and to perform penetration and vulnerability testing. And this is something that's critically important, and it was a topic of a webcast that we had done in early January. As I said last time, ransomware has the potential to wreak havoc in a very short period of time for those who are not prepared for this threat. Given the increased warnings by the regulators, think of the regulatory repercussions if your business if your clients have been put at risk because of your lack of preparation. I know we are not IT experts, and however unfair it is, the risk associated with cyber threats is now part of our domain. I urge everyone to act if you have not. You must be able to demonstrate to your various constituents, including the regulators, that you understand the various cybersecurity threats and have a reasonable strategy designed to prevent, detect, and respond to those threats, including ransomware. Next slide, Maria, please. For almost 30 years, Michael Bryce of BW Cyber Services has been providing technology security solutions across a broad spectrum of public, private, and government agency clients, including the heavy regulated financial services and healthcare industries. Michael's clients have included the U.S. military and Department of Defense, which makes sense given Michael served as an officer in the U.S. Marine Corps prior and received training by the NSA in signals intelligence. Following the service to the United States, Michael held executive positions leading IT strategy and related enterprise software services for various well-known firms, including as principal at Booz Allen, partner at Unisys, and chief information officer at the Industrial Distribution Group. Michael is a frequent speaker at industry events, and his firm BW Cyber Services, provides an array of cybersecurity consulting to numerous NFA members and SEC registrants, including some of the world's largest private fund advisors. Michael's clients also include some of the same regulators that may be conducting your audit, where he provides specialized cybersecurity training to their examiners. Michael was a recent keynote speaker at the member workshop produced by the NFA in New York earlier this month. Next slide, Maria. Sorry, Michael, it was your turn, and I.
Well, John, I got to tell you, I think you did a great job. Basically, I don't have a whole lot to add to that other than I want to thank the participants for being on the phone here. And as always, we make these webinars focused not on what we do, but what we think our clients and others would want to learn and be able to action upon with more information, knowing what's going on out there. With all the information and questions that we've been asked about related to WannaCry, we recognize that it's a very pertinent issue with respect to what's going on in the world today. And hopefully, for the participants on the phone, what you'll take away is it's not just WannaCry, but it's the understanding of the threat out there, and that we're all at risk, not just those of us that are multi-billion-dollar funds or organizations with large web pages, but basically anybody with an email address is now in the front line of this cyber war. So with that said, I appreciate the opportunity. I'm looking forward to jumping in and talking about some of the experiences we've had here. And with that, John, I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks. Next slide, Maria, please. Paul Caiazzo is founder and chief security architect at TrueShield Security Solutions, where he provides strategic cybersecurity-related advice to senior executives of a diverse client base, including several United States federal agencies, such as the U.S. Department of Transportation and the U.S. Commodity Futures Trading Commission. Paul's expertise is extensive, including cybersecurity architecture, information assurance, and continuous detection and mitigation programs with a focus on continuous monitoring, vulnerability management, incident response, and security operations center support. Prior to co-founding TrueShield, Paul was employed with Northrop Grumman Mission Systems and Savvis Communications. Paul?
Thanks, John, and thanks to the audience for attending today. Just another quick tidbit of information. So since we do 24/7 monitoring, we saw quite a lot of activity over the weekend with respect to WannaCry, and we're able to release some pretty, I think, effective threat advisories to clients to help protect them. So we have, I think, some direct experience with this specific incident that I'll be able to share a little bit later on. So again, thanks for attending, and looking forward to talking later.
Next slide, Maria. Look, the topic of this ransomware is kind of the WannaCry ransomware. We're going to explain it, how bad it is, reporting, recovery, the attack vectors, and what we mean by that is how does the ransomware or the malware get into affect a certain machine or a network and the protective controls. Next slide, Maria. Everyone's heard of WannaCry. You know, it's only affected Microsoft Windows computers. It's affected those that are out of date and have not been patched. That's why it's so important to make sure that all your patches occur timely. It's affected more than 2,000 computers in 150 countries, and there was 33 domains found to be associated with WannaCry. And those domains, I believe, are listed on some of the releases that Paul just talked about that were issued by his firm. As sensational as the WannaCry attack has been, it's been relatively muted in terms of the financial loss. But that said, the next one could be a lot worse. The WannaCry had a kill switch in it that I'm sure everyone's heard about, where it looked to a certain web address, and if it existed, it killed the WannaCry. However, shortly thereafter, another variant was issued that did not have that kill switch. Next slide, Maria. So I'm sure everyone now understands the great threat that ransomware is. The probability of having to institute your disaster recovery procedures is drastically increased. The threat is mutating weekly, and as I just said, new variants of the WannaCry are being released now, and it's very easy for anyone to get into the game. High school kids can cheaply buy kiddie scripts off of the internet for relatively inexpensive amounts of money if they want to get in the game. Now their motivations might be much different than that of organized crime, but the ability to wreak havoc on your systems is still the same. It can shut down your business until the ransom is paid or the backup is installed, and then there's no guarantee that the keys to unlock the crypto lock are actually going to work. And the regulatory impact, whether it's the 20647, Regulation SP, or Regulation SID, compliance officers have to be aware of what the different threats are. I know that many investment advisors do not believe that they meet the definition of a financial institution under Regulation SID, and perhaps they don't, but the risk is pervasive that if not captured by Reg SID, it certainly is by Regulation 20647, and Reg SID provides that framework to assess the risk. Summertime is when a lot of investment advisors perform their annual review. As part of that, please make sure that you address the risks associated with the various cyber threats that are there. Next slide, Maria. While there's no rule that says that you have to report a breach, there are reporting requirements if PII, personal identified information, is stolen, and many states have their own regulations of when you have to report different to different groups, and I know that Michael has specific experience with regards to the FBI and whether or not they're going to be helpful. Michael?
Yeah, thank you, John. One of the things we're finding here is when you have a breach, and whether it's WannaCry or some other ransomware, or for that matter, a breach not related to that, perhaps a fraudulent wire transfer, it comes down to two issues reporting here. One is if you want to call the FBI and you're in trouble, what we're finding that's very shocking is it depends on where the activity occurs. We've seen it where in the larger cities, the FBI literally said, if you lost less than $1 million, consider yourself lucky, we're too busy to help. In other instances, away from the bigger cities, the FBI has said, don't do anything, we'll be there in 5 minutes, and we're not only going to figure out who did this, but we'll get you reconstituted without even having to call a cyber firm. Now, I'm not sure how well they can do that. In many instances, they know the variant, and if you know the variant, there may be a key out there that's publicly available. But the point to know here is that this has become such a ubiquitous issue that U.S. law enforcement is overwhelmed. And the key to understand here that, unfortunately, I'm reporting that we didn't quite hit here, but you need to be aware of, is the whole issue related to due diligence and future investors. And we're finding that from a due diligence perspective, future investors are very savvy with cyber, and they want to know if you've been breached. And if you have, it sets up a red flag to understand why did that happen and how do you remediate. And I can tell you from personal experience, telling an investor that the remediation was performed by paying a Bitcoin is not a very good answer. Maria, next. So with that said, I think the primary reason why everybody's on the call here is to find out, at least ostensibly, what is WannaCry? And I'm going to address WannaCry by saying, I'm going to tell you what it is, but really say it's not just a single piece of software. It's more related to a group of software that exists and is used by hundreds, if not thousands, or even more criminals worldwide. And the scary part here is WannaCry was a variant of a ransomware that basically it's a software virus. And the reason why it got out is it leveraged a tool that had been released by an organization that put it out for anybody's consumption that identified vulnerabilities related to Windows operating systems. Now, there was enough time that for savvy organizations and for organizations that do periodic updates to be able to get the patch released from Microsoft and fix that vulnerability. As you all are becoming aware, and as John referred to earlier, many organizations do not update their software on a continuous basis. It's a basic control. When we talk about controls, that's a very basic one. And when it's not performed on a periodic basis, bad things happen. So in this instance, the WannaCry, the kit that supports WannaCry was released. We're not sure yet who put it out. There are some thoughts that it came from North Korea. I'm always reluctant on the early findings because there's always people to rush to say they think they know who did it. But the point here is that it was exceptionally effective on the release, as demonstrated by how it went through Europe and how we heard about it on the news and how you all are aware of it now. Fortunately for most of you out there, though, the implementation of that release was very poor. Now, the idea was to leverage a security vulnerability within the Microsoft operating system. Most systems that were affected, by the way, were Windows 7. To then lock up a computer or an entire system. We've seen both. So if you look to the right of your screen here, that is an actual screenshot of a WannaCry infected computer. And basically, the computer's locked. You're offered a certain amount of time to provide them Bitcoin extortion. And even if you do pay, the guarantee on getting it unencrypted is not there. Some organizations have received the key to unencrypt their data. Others have not. So there's a certain amount of time to pay. What's not mentioned is that to pay with a Bitcoin, you'd have to have some infrastructure yourself to be able to provide a Bitcoin payment. And these things all become more complicated. And imagine, as we'll talk to in a minute, that not just a single computer, but as we saw through a number of health organizations in Europe, the entire infrastructure was locked up, the entire system. In many instances, what we've seen is when organizations, asset managers are locked up, they cannot work for at least a day. In many instances, it takes more than 1 day, 2 to 3 days, or a complete rebuild of their data. And the risk related to this goes beyond just not being able to operate, but if there's a shift in the market or some kind of activity that requires a fiduciary duty related to trading that's not able to happen, that organization puts itself in the forefront of litigatory threat and related issues there. So it's important to understand not just what it is, which is a virus that locks up all your data and encrypts it. It's important to understand that it's not just a quick payment and extortion, because there's infrastructure behind doing that. In this instance, the demand was a percentage of a Bitcoin that was basically $300, which quite frankly is just a drop in the bucket. What we saw was that mixed results were reported after payment, meaning some people did get your decryption keys, others did not. What was very interesting here was that the total payout right now has been estimated at only $100,000. Now we don't want this to be a false positive for people to go, oh my goodness, well that's not a big deal. It's a huge deal. We were exceptionally lucky on WannaCry, and the message here is that the next round, because there's more kits that have come out and they have already modified this kit, the next round of infections are going to be much, much, much more insidious. And we know that because in 2016, ransomware and related extortion that did not have the benefit of CIA-supported tools that identified unknown vulnerabilities, just the regular ransomware kits that were available, totaled over $1 billion collected in Bitcoin payments. It's the dirty little secret in the industry is that most organizations are very, very reluctant and completely unwilling to report or admit that they've been crypto locked or hit by a ransom infection, because it reflects poorly on them, and obviously it's going to affect the way investors are going to look at them. So the key to take away from this is, while this attack was poorly executed, it's almost a foregone conclusion that the next attack, which will be coming soon, if not already being put out in the wild, will be much, much, much more effective and much more insidious, probably more expensive also. Maria, next slide. So with that said, understanding that ransomware, and in this instance WannaCry, is a form of a virus that locks up your computer, where does it come from and how does it proliferate? In a nutshell, if you think about the CIA tool is a mechanism of transport, the ransomware itself is available as a service, which is just amazing if you think about it. It's created by various organized crime syndicates, mostly in Eastern Europe, that perfect this like an optimized business. They have platforms. The term I like is crimeware as a service, where you can purchase a ransomware kit and then do your own phishing campaigns and other ways to get it to extort people's businesses. They have formulas where you can partner with the organized crime syndicate and share your extorted income. It is amazing. And if you look at the data here on the left, and this is relatively recent data from 2016, the net here is that over 50% of organizations have been hit with some form of a ransomware attack. What we've found in the asset management industry is that close to 1 in 4 have not only been hit with an attack, but those attacks have been successful. When I do speaking events at conferences and we go over this, I find that 1 out of 4 attendees has some story related to how either their entire organization or a member within their organization had a computer that was crypto locked, and they either had to recreate from scratch or had to pay the ransom. Of note here, if you look at the last bullet on the right, Athena, which was released last Friday by WikiLeaks, is another new CIA attacking tool that targets all versions of Windows. and it could and probably will be used in the very near future to do the same thing that WannaCry did. And this is where I believe we speak on empirics and not just a subjective opinion. This is why we strongly believe and expect to see another similar attack come out in the very near future. One thing to note here is this is not just related to machines, although the last two do target Windows machines. Ransomware also attacks and targets Android and Windows phones, most notably though it's targeted on Android, and we saw a fourfold increase in Android's attacks as reported by Kaspersky towards the end of last year. That's only going to increase because of the ubiquitous reliance on mobile phones and the amount of business importance it is with many people actually doing work remotely from their mobile phones. Next slide, Maria. So how bad is it? And I'm going to speak at a high level here to how bad it is with some trends and statistics across the industry. And then I'm going to turn it over to Paul Kaizo from TrueShield, who literally is in the trenches every day. Whereas at BW Cyber Services, we work within the asset management industry and deal with financial CTAs, CPOs, hedge funds, and RIAs who have been crypto locked or dealing with it, as well as providing compliance solutions and supporting controls to help prevent the attacks. Paul is one who's seeing it across multiple industries and can really talk to a lot of the larger, really difficult or nefarious attacks out there. But before we jump into that, from a high level, we're seeing 1 in 4 asset managers are either attacked or have either expected to be attacked or will be attacked. And by attacked, we mean actually locked, not just getting the email, but are actually getting locked. It is what we consider to be the dirty little secret in the asset management business. When managers and others are attacked, 72% of those could not access their data for, sorry, that's a typo there, could not access their data for at least 2 days. So imagine the reputational impact and the operational potential for liability if your organization is not able to perform its job for or operate for 2 days. Another 30%, 32% couldn't access for 5 days. And the timelines here relate to 2 things. One is if they pay a Bitcoin, how quickly they can get back into running. In other instances, because we advise most people to not pay, how long it takes to do a restore from backup. And unfortunately, most organizations that we work with, while they have a DR plan, and obviously it's an NFA or an SEC requirement, don't test their DR plan or have not tested it appropriately. And a DR plan that has not been tested is not a DR plan. And often, when these organizations are required to recreate from a ransomware attack like WannaCry, the amount of time it takes to get back to operating is much longer and much more difficult than they imagined. There's also the potential for ransomware to be spread to clients and third-party vendors, which inherits additional liability. And interestingly enough, now we're seeing it coming from, not so much from third parties, although it's possible, but coming from clients, because as you can imagine, clients have the least amount of protections and controls and are very susceptible. And there's always a familiarity related to dealing with your clients, and in many instances, the ransomware is being spread by an email that might look like it's coming from your client and be from your client, but actually have been performed because the client's been breached. So what we're seeing is the costs of ransomware deal with not just being out of business, but how to mitigate it, loss of operating capabilities, reputational effects. And with that, I'll let Paul go ahead and talk to the specifics here, both on reporting recovery and related impact, as well as a couple case studies. Paul?
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, so a couple more points about, I'm going to really frame this around WannaCry specifically. So if you on the phone happen to have been hit by WannaCry, first off, I'm sorry you lost your weekend trying to recover from this. We certainly had quite a few phone calls this last weekend trying to clean up after this mess. There really are only a couple of choices, and the way that WannaCry works, first off, it requires you to pay that 1 Bitcoin. I think it's within 24 hours. It doubles to $600 or 2 Bitcoins shortly thereafter, and gives a threat of deletion of data if you don't make any action or take any action within, I think, 3 days. So effectively, your choices are, number one, you could pay the ransom and hope that that criminal releases your data and gives you the correct decryption key. As Michael mentioned earlier, it's not often the case that they work every time. Certainly, there are cases to be studied wherein people paid the ransom and then the decryption keys that they were given didn't work, and so it was, effectively. Worst case scenario there, you paid the ransom, you still cannot access your files, and you're still locked out. Preferably, if you're able to, rebuild from backup. That's going to be your probably least costly solution, with the only caveat to that being that there's going to be some time involved in that recovery process. And the additional wrinkle to that is most organizations that we talk to, they do backups, or they think they're doing backups, but they never test restoring them, and they never test recovering data from a backup. And what often happens is that when they actually, the worst does happen, you're relying upon that safety valve, your backup, you try to restore it and it doesn't work, or there's some issue with corrupt databases or things like that. And at that point, you're again back at square one. You either have to rebuild, or just I think turn the lights off and go home, because your third choice there is to lose everything, which is obviously a non-choice. So I think the better way to look at this is to seek to prevent, if at all possible, seek to prevent, because in this case, prevention is certainly worth many pounds of cure, and avoiding the ransomware outbreak is obviously going to be better than getting it in the first place and trying to recover from it. There are impacts above and beyond just the simple, my data got locked up and I'm unable to work. First off, you're going to have to hire people like us to come in and, number one, either help you clean up or negotiate some settlement with the attackers, which we've done for clients before. When they, a couple of clients have been, their entire systems have been, completely locked up, and I'll talk about one a little bit later. That we were able to help them get a lower ransom and pay the Bitcoin for them. Not a fun situation to find yourself in. You're often also going to need to consult your corporate attorney, and it's quite likely that if you've been locked, one of the other facets of those attack tools that Michael mentioned is the ability to exfiltrate data. So not only is your data being locked, but it's being stolen from you simultaneously, and that could include personally identifiable information. So it's quite likely then that you're required to notify clients. And if you're not required, it may be wise to do some voluntary notification in the event that data is leaked onto, for instance, the dark web, where data often winds up. And if you're found to have been liable for that, there could be some potential litigation or risk in that regard going forward. And again, if you're found to have been at least, if for no other reason through negligence liable for that loss of PII, you may have to go purchase that identity monitoring service for your clients. You're probably going to lose clients in the process of that, and there's going to be, that confidence lost, which I don't think needs to be really reinforced with the audience on the phone here, because you guys, your entire business is based upon your clients having confidence that you're, taking care of them and their assets are in good hands with you. And I'll tell you one thing I think that often people overlook with this sort of thing is, a ransomware attack is stressful. You're going to have a clock ticking down that says if you don't do something by this time, you're never going to get your data back. And in the meantime, as not an IT person, I can't even imagine what might be going through the head of the individual, on the wrong side of the computer for an incident like this, because you just simply don't know what to do. So you're scrambling, and there's quite a bit of stress involved in that, and that's time that you're not able to focus on actually doing, the work of your job. So the impacts are pretty far-reaching. And there are, a couple recovery options, but as always, like I said, it's much, much better to try to prevent if you possibly can. So we'll talk next about attack vectors and how ransomware is spread. And I'm really going to focus this around how do we prevent some of the spread. So specifically with respect to WannaCry. WannaCry was interesting in that it used a pretty sophisticated exploit tool, which was, a CIA nation-state developed, leaked to WikiLeaks. That in and of itself raises a lot of kind of ethical questions inside the security community about whether or not nation-states should be holding on to weaponized exploits like this. And Microsoft in particular released a statement saying that they think there should be a digital Geneva Convention wherein different nation states disclose what sort of tool sets and toolkits that they have in a means to kind of control the situation. Personally, I think that might not be a bad idea, because that, if not to hand the tools to everybody, we certainly aren't suggesting that, but at least so that people know what's out there. At the end of the day, that I think protects a lot of people, because the missing patches that were really at the root of this, they were 0-day or not known to Microsoft prior to the exploit actually being released. Had Microsoft known about it, they would have released the patch earlier, and the issue would never have come up in the first place. So number one, ransomware spread by spear phishing and phishing and malicious websites and things like that. But what it's really doing is it's exploiting missing patches. And so prevention step number one, keep your systems patched up to date. If you even had automatic updates on your Windows machines in March when the patch for this was actually released, then you probably didn't have an issue with WannaCry. And maybe, again, that's a situation where you were lucky because you turned on auto updates. If you didn't have auto updates on and you have not patched your systems yet, you need to go do that immediately. And I'd say as soon as you get off this webinar, go make sure your systems are patched with the corresponding patches. But at the end of the day, you of course need to be preparing your users to identify phishing emails, identifying spear phishing emails, and preparing them to avoid either clicking on links, downloading attachments, or sharing information with the attacker. Vast majority of this stuff does happen by spear phishing, at least as that initial infection vector. One thing about WannaCry which was interesting is that it effectively went out and scanned large sections of the internet looking for machines that were vulnerable to the exploit that the CIA developed. And so it actually worked kind of like a worm, if you're familiar with that term within, or the difference between a virus and worm. Basically self-propagates, able to move around without any human interaction and just via how it's programmed go and infect more machines. So in that case, there's some network architecture stuff that has to be done to make sure that you're preventing the spread of this stuff. But really, truly, end of the day, patch your systems and make sure that you're preparing your users to identify social engineering attacks. A lot of these will come through as looking as very, very legitimate, and it's going to be hard for an organization to actually be able to tell that what happened or the email that they received was malicious. There are some ways to do it, and I'm going to talk about a couple of phishing case studies on the next slide, which is speaking about a couple of incidents that happened at Barclays Bank. Now, I'm not suggesting via this slide that Barclays was hit by WannaCry. I don't know whether or not they were, but I do know that their customers were attacked with some pretty sophisticated phishing attacks that were, relatively successful. I don't know the exact percentage of clicks on these, but I know that these were significant enough to get, some headline space. So clearly, some people fell victim to this. So the first I'm going to talk about there was a phishing attack that was perpetrated in January this year. It was really focused on harvesting account information or personally identifiable information. And what was interesting about this is that the attackers, they compromised a website called barclay.co.uk, and that's not Barclays, and that site actually has nothing to do with Barclays. But because the clever attackers realized that somebody seeing barclay.co.uk would very likely assume that that's a legitimate website, they went and hacked that website and then used that to facilitate the rest of the attack. So I thought that was a pretty clever means of getting around some of those initial sort of steps you always take when you're training a user to avoid a phishing attack. And if you see in the upper right-hand corner there, the red circle around the email address is infosecurity@barclay.co.uk. So it appears to be relatively legitimate to your average user. If you really if you read closely, there are a couple of typos in there, and that's always a giveaway. You're never going to see typos in a security email from any reputable organization. That's just not going to happen. But what this email asked individuals to do was to verify their accounts and effectively log in, or in other words, provide their account credentials to the attackers. And so if they were to click in that login to get started link that you see there, they'd be taken to a page where they provide their account number, their username, email address, and things like that. And I know that's all stuff that's kind of traditional phishing. You've probably seen that sort of thing many times. But again, I think what's interesting about this is that they compromised this barclay.co.uk in order to facilitate this next attack. And so they're getting better at trying to avoid that the kind of the initial obvious training steps that you take to let people know, make sure the email looks like it's coming from a legitimate address. And I'd be willing to bet the majority of people on the phone, if they saw that email come in from infosecurity at barclay.co.uk, you probably would at least initially think that that's a legitimate email. So be very careful, I guess, is the net of that. The attack 2 that I'm going to talk about actually just happened last couple days. So this month, May 27, another phishing attack. I'm sorry, Maria, go back one slide. So attack 2 is just, again, happened a couple days ago. It's a phishing attack, again, against Barclays customers. In this case, what they actually did, the bad guys directed the victims to go and download some sensitive documents that were awaiting in Barclays Cloud IT service. And if you're a Barclays customer, you have access to this Cloud IT wherein documents get shared between yourself and your banker. And so, it's a pretty legitimate looking email. Basically says, hey, go log on online and then download these documents. And in this situation, victims that clicked that link were taken to a site that looked, remarkably similar to Barclays. The URL would have been, quite different. This actually did not use that same barclay.co.uk. But once they did that, they first were asked to log in, so they provided their credentials to the bad guys, and then they're asked to download these documents. The documents weren't actually documents. Surprise, surprise. They were exploit kits and malware. And so this was kind of the double whammy because they were, first off, they were phished and giving up sensitive personal information about their credentials, and then secondly, malware kits downloaded directly onto their computers. And that's a pretty common scenario for a ransomware initial infection vector. Tricking somebody to download a malicious file is usually how that stuff starts. In this case, again, this is so new, I'm not certain how many people actually were impacted by this, but I'd imagine since it was newsworthy, it was a pretty significant percentage. So we can go on to the next slide, Maria, and I'm going to talk about what's the worst that could happen. And so this is a specific case study about a services organization that we helped. Not a large organization, but still pretty sensitive with respect to what their business was. But since they kind of were a mom and pop shop, they really had that misconception that they're just not a target, they're not on anybody's radar. And I'll tell you what, I hear that very, very frequently within the asset management community, that I'm too small, I'm not on anyone's radar. If that's running through your head out there in the audience listening to this, I assure you it does not matter if you're on somebody's radar or not. You could simply be in the wrong place at the wrong time. And then secondarily, it's likely that since attackers are just seeking to monetize, their exploit kits, they're going to go where the money is. And so I would think asset managers are probably a pretty high-value target for the majority of attackers that are out there just for organized crime purposes. But back to this example, these guys are really lackadaisical security. And all based around that, they didn't think they were a target. So in this case, they got phished, and a particularly virulent strain of malware called Locky was downloaded. Locky, if you remember what Michael mentioned earlier, last year about $1 billion was lost to ransomware. Locky was like 60% of that. So it's a really significant ransomware from last year. So this happened really close to the end of the month for this organization, and they did not have the ability to contain it internally, and they didn't even really know it until it gotten so far that basically their entire systems are locked up. All their productivity systems, servers which house their accounting systems, their payroll systems, which they still did in-house, stuff like that, all got locked up. And they had basically, their hands were utterly tied. So what they did, they ended up calling their cyber insurance broker and tried to initiate a claim against that. And at that point, the insurance company called us in to help them figure out what happened and get back to operating state. Unfortunately, they didn't have any backups. It was basically the first thing we looked at is what can we do to get you back up and running? Let's take a look at backups. They had some, but again, they weren't really useful from a restorative perspective, and so we couldn't get them back up and running with backups, and we, in the end, had to pay the ransom for these guys. Of course, that got charged back to them, but we were able to facilitate that Bitcoin transaction. So they had to pay that, and then, of course, they had to pay some pretty significant incident response fees to us to help them, get back to operating state. And there's many examples like that, and it's actually kind of frightening how frequently this does happen. And Michael mentioned earlier that something like 1 in 4 asset managers are targeted. I think that might even be a conservative, not just targeted, but actually attacked. There are a couple of other recent examples which I think are also noteworthy. One phishing attack which had some pretty significant impacts involved Google Documents and tricking people into clicking links in Google Documents that looked legitimate, but again, at the end of the day, were simply just used to download malware. There's a lot of examples like that, and there are many more exploit kits and tools being released day by day. Michael mentioned Athena earlier. I'm absolutely certain that we're going to see another pretty significant attack based upon either that exploit kit or one of the other ones that was nation-state developed and leaked onto WikiLeaks in the very near future. I would put that, within the window of probably the next couple of weeks, we'll see another major ransomware incident that affects kind of global scale stuff. And I think we're also going to see it focused on a couple of industries that there's a lot to lose, being healthcare and financial services. Of those two, I think are probably going to be the most significant targets. So I guess the net on that is the next round of attacks, it's just going to get better. It's going to get more sophisticated. We can't tell you exactly what's going to happen next because they're going to continue developing stuff. But based upon the trends that we've seen, these tools, which were effectively stolen from our intelligence agencies or the United States intelligence agencies, are going to be used against not only us but the rest of the world in general. So go back to those prevention steps, make sure your systems are patched, and make sure that you've got an effective incident response plan and that you've got good backups and that you train your users to notice social engineering attacks. So I'm going to hand back to Michael.
Great, Paul. Thank you very much. That was excellent. Interestingly enough, you mentioned the Google Docs. One that we've actually seen, it's out recently, is DocuSign. And it's a particularly insidious one because a lot of people are using DocuSign to sign documents. And I had a client just this week that sent us a DocuSign document. And I had to follow up with them and say, no, we're not going to take it. We have other means and encrypted email capabilities. But so just be on the lookout now if you use DocuSign to make sure two things. One, you're expecting a document to be signed, and just because it comes from a trusted customer or another entity, third party, doesn't mean that it's a trusted document. For various reasons, they could have been reached, or you could be getting a spoofed email that appears it's from them, but it's not. The point there is, we're still just touching the tip of the iceberg. The attackers are always ahead of defenders, but there is a solution here that there is hope. First off, training is your first line of defense. One of the first questions that we get asked when we go in to help do an assessment is, it's so complicated. I talked to somebody else that said they wanted $50,000 or more. We can't afford it. It's too complicated. What do we do? Well, it's actually not too complicated. So the first line of defense is training. And I would say, by virtue of being on the call here, you're investing in that training already, an hour of your time. The key there, though, is you need to get training to your entire staff. And the fact is, you can get training out there. It's publicly available. If you want to reach out to me afterwards, we have tools that are free. We'll provide them to you and your organization. And they're short 5, 10, 15-minute videos that explain phishing, that explain all the other activities that criminals are using that you want your staff to be aware of. Along with that, the most important thing we'd recommend is you get an assessment to go over your vulnerabilities and weaknesses, as well as determine the primary attack vectors, which is a fancy way of saying that the most common ways that an attacker might get into and affect your organization. And by the way, if you're a registrant, it is a requirement, whether you're on the SEC, CFTC, NFA, or FINRA side of things, to have a cybersecurity program. And this satisfies that requirement. and it does mitigate what may be litigatory issues if you don't have that, or regulatory issues, because being breached and not being compliant is a double whammy. After doing an assessment, your next step would be to do some kind of penetration testing. This is where you really get a good feel for how tight things are, not just based on what you think or what your IT vendor tells you, but to get some empirical data that goes with that. We're often asked, okay, I get all that, and we're going to move forward, but what are some of the industry best practices that we should implement to help us immediately? So, the first one is training. There's some other very simple ones. Paul talked about one of the primary ones, which is software patching and updating. I cannot tell you how many times I've dealt with systematic traders that don't want to touch any of their software because they're worried it'll affect their algorithms, and we understand that. But the fact is, if you're not updating and patching your operating system as well as your other software, those are the primary ways that an attacker can get in. In this instance, if you were phished with the WannaCry software but had updated your patches, even if you clicked on that link, nothing would have happened. So the key there, as Paul mentioned, and as I'll reiterate, is it's all about controls in place that are going to mitigate your risk. Password complexity and usage is another one. I can't tell you all how many times that we run into individuals and organizations that they use the same password for everything in their life, whether it's personal or professional. And it turns out that often an account might be breached. LinkedIn was breached in 2014. Passwords that went with that were breached. And people that reuse those same passwords end up providing free access to individuals who buy those passwords on the dark web into their organization. We see that over and over. The next one that Paul hit, and I cannot reiterate enough, is backup and recovery. I review DR and BCP plans as a part of our practice, and whereas I am often impressed with the business continuity plans because they do focus on who you deal with operationally, and people understand that, the DR plans are almost always not up to par, and even more so are not tested. And a bad DR plan is one thing that's not gonna help you. Of course, a DR plan that's not even tested isn't even worth the paper that it's written on. And unfortunately, when we talk about ransomware, which is the most probably the highest threat / risk, along with fraudulent wire transfers, without practicing your DR, you are going to be highly susceptible for pain that is not necessary. There are a number of other controls. I won't go through all of them, but web protection services, data encryption, user privilege, all of these things would be reviewed in an assessment. There are also outsourced services that can be provided that go beyond that, like managed security service offering. These are basically having your network managed in a way that anytime an intruder or a virus or ransomware-like activity might hit it, you immediately get an alert. So with that said, I'd like to go ahead and move on to the next slide and open it up for questions. I think the most important part of these webinars is to get questions from the field, what specifically people have in mind. So Maria, I'll return it back to you, and if there are any questions, let's jump right in.
Thank you, Michael. Yes, there were a few questions. The first one I think would be directed towards you, and the question is, what is your biggest concern or issue related to ransomware?
Is that for Michael?
Yes, that is for Michael.
I'm sorry, Maria, I thought you said that was for John. Yeah, my number one primary concern with ransomware is, and we talked about this, it's the lack of appreciation for the risk. Invariably, we find that when we talk to asset managers, literally all the way up to about 3 billion AUM, they tell us nobody knows who we are, we don't have a website, we don't go on CNBC, so we're not at risk. It's not a big deal. And I would say it's just the understanding that everybody's at risk now. We're all in the middle of a global cyber warfare in which, without taking some basic precautions, both from a regulatory compliance perspective, but more importantly from an existential protections perspective, you are opening yourself up to tremendous risk and liability that's not necessary. And so it all starts with education and understanding that this is actually not that complicated, and not that expensive.
Great, thank you, Michael. The next question, I believe, would be for Paul. Paul, can you please provide some technical guidance on securing my system against this or a new attack?
Yeah, sure. Let's talk WannaCry. There's a specific patch that's available for all Microsoft Windows operating systems. If you have a pen, note it's called MS17-010. That patch is freely available from Microsoft, and they actually made it available for even old, outdated, no longer supported operating systems, because Microsoft realized how serious a situation this is. This does affect all Windows operating systems. So if you're running old Windows XP or Windows Server 2003, know, number one, that you should have upgraded from those unsupported operating systems quite some time ago, but also know that because of the seriousness of the situation, Microsoft made patches available, which is actually an unprecedented move for them. So go and install that patch immediately. Second point that you need to be thinking about is the network-based infection vector. And if anybody out there either manages a firewall or has somebody manage a firewall for them, you need to make sure that port 445 is blocked. Inbound port 445 is called server message block, is the protocol that was used to deliver WannaCry. So port 445 inbound from the internet needs to be blocked. The stuff that's coming next is going to probably exploit the same vulnerabilities. So again, make sure you're patched. But then it's probably also going to be looking at some different ports that should not be open to the internet. One of those is called Microsoft Remote Desktop Protocol, or port 3389. That should also be blocked to the internet, and I would take those steps immediately. That will protect you from, first off, WannaCry, and then secondly, what I think is likely going to be next in line. So again, patch, block 445, block 3389.
Great, thank you, Paul. I did have another question. This one is for John. John, what is the best way to document your cyber risk assessment in your 2647 annual review?
Sure. Thanks, Maria. With regards to the cyber threat, get the input and the help from your IT folks. And if you don't have in-house IT folks and understanding that you're not an IT expert, find an IT expert vendor. There's lots out there. Both Michael and Paul firms provide the services, but you want to do your due diligence on those firms and who they are. We've had a lot of clients who have used various groups. A number have used Michael's firm to do penetration testing, and the cost to engaging those firms or do that testing doesn't have to be as crazy as some of the numbers that you see. So certainly reach out to those firms. But in terms of your policies and procedures, assess your risks there. Do you have people that work from home that have laptops? If they're working from home, are they dialing in from a home computer? Those are risks that you should identify and say, look, who else is using those computers? Who's going to use that laptop when you're at home? The SEC comes in and they realize, people are doing these. They're looking to see what kind of procedures that you have to address those risks. So at least say that, look, nobody else can use your laptop at home. You should not be on a family computer at home dialing in or somehow getting into your system computers. So there's a lot just in your regular policies and procedures that you can look at. Where are the risks that where there's cyber threat that somebody can get into your systems? Thanks, Maria.
Great, thank you, John. I did have two more questions. This next one is for Michael. Michael, how do regulators view ransomware? Specifically, must a ransomware attack be reported?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I've been working with the regulators closely. First off, they want to be notified if you're breached or if you are affected by some form of ransomware. But I would advise that you are not under an obligation to notify them or anyone else as long as you don't have PII released. Now, I would say caveat that with study your local state regulations. So I'm only speaking from the NFA and SEC regulatory perspective. But what's interesting here is there are existing and newly emerging forms of ransomware that are a little more insidious than what we saw with WannaCry, and we expect to see more of them. And what they're doing is they're not just locking up or encrypting your data, they're also downloading that data to the attackers. And if you had PII that was encrypted, you're no longer able to assume that a ransomware attack only locked your system, which many registrants did and therefore didn't report. You now have to assume that you've had PII released. So that opens a whole can of worms with respect to reporting to the regulators, reporting to the FBI, and reporting to your clients. And where this can get really tricky is if you don't know what form of ransomware you're dealing with, or you don't know if you had PII, or you don't know if they were able to get PII and you don't report, and then it shows up for sale on the dark web, or have somebody who just feels the need to brag about the fact that they stole your data, which is what we see often. Motivations for attackers go from monetization to just pure reputational enhancement. And so it really does open up a bigger can of worms than just, do I pay the Bitcoin or reconstruct from backup. It has a long tail of operational threats and risks that continue to grow over time if not addressed very quickly.
Great, thank you, Michael. This is the last question that we have for today. This one's for Paul. Paul, I only visit trusted websites. Am I still at risk?
Yeah, you are. So the questions are on trusted websites, and that whole concept, I think, is maybe a little flawed, and there's some reasons why. The majority of the kind of web-facilitated attacks wherein you accidentally go to the wrong website and you download some malicious software without you even knowing it, a lot of that is delivered through malicious ads, and those ads can be served up on otherwise trusted websites, or quote-unquote trusted websites. There are some pretty high-profile examples of this that have happened in the past. CNET is a an online news kind of clearinghouse where you can find technology news and stuff like that. And there was an incident, it was several years ago now, but wherein their ad channel was compromised, and many of the ads that they were serving up actually had malicious code embedded in them. So no, unfortunately, it's not enough to just go to, quote, trusted websites. You still have to make sure your systems are patched. You still have to take the correct steps to even secure the browser. One of the best things you can do is install an ad blocker on your browser. Chrome, I think the best one in my opinion is called uBlock Origins. That's, again, just my opinion. And there are other add-ons or extensions for the other browsers as well. But bottom line, practice kind of that safe cyber hygiene stuff wherein you're patching your systems, keeping them up to date, and try to not visit stuff that's obviously bad. So don't go to torrent websites, don't go to dark web websites, things like that, and obviously unsafe stuff. But still, you need to be hyper vigilant because, as Michael mentioned, this is they're getting pretty sophisticated in the exploit kits. You're not even going to know that it's been downloaded until something blows up on your desktop, and by that point, it's too late. So.
Great, thank you, Paul. John, did you have closing remarks?
Sure, I just want to thank everybody for joining us today. We're going to follow up with an email in the next 24, 48 hours with a link and a copy of this presentation that you can use. In addition, we talked about penetration testing. We still may have copies of that presentation that we did a few months ago if you're interested in that as well. Just send one of us an email and let us know. But again, thank you for joining us today. We hope you found it useful. Thank you.